Okay, good morning and welcome to today's webinar. We appreciate you all joining us. My name is Isabella Perry and I'm going to be your moderator. This presentation is on Beyond the Hype, Building Responsible AI with ISO IEC 42001 certification, presented by PJR's ISMS SMS QMS lead auditor and executive committee member, Brandon Avenatti. So now I have some quick housekeeping. So there will be a Q&A at the end of today's webinar. So please hold any questions to the end of today's webinar, and we will hopefully be able to answer any of your questions. If there are any questions for our presenter after today's presentation, please go to pgr.com and inquire there using our email or our chat to learn more about anything. The slides and the recording will be available on our website after our presentation, as well as on our YouTube. Any additional questions there, you can use the website or our comment section on our YouTube channel. Now, Brandon will take it away discussing today's topic.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Brandon Avenatti. I am a QMS, ISMS, and ITSMS lead auditor with Perry Johnson Registrars. I'm here to talk to you a little today about ISO IEC 42001 and essentially building a responsible AI program with ISO IEC 42001. So if we look around the boardroom whiteboard today, we'll see the exact same challenge boiling over, right? Everyone wants to move fast with artificial intelligence. SaaS companies are scaling it. Healthcare providers are diagnosing with it. Financial institutions are automating decisions with it. But there's a massive paradox, right? The faster we move, the higher the anxiety. So how do we prove our AI is safe? How do we prove it isn't biased? And how do we stop clients from hitting us with 100-page security questionnaires before they even sign a contract? Before we dive in, let's go ahead and launch a quick poll on our screens right now. The question here, right? Sorry, guys. The question here, right, is what is your organization's biggest hurdle with AI adoption right now? So managing internal risks, bias, data leakage, model drift, and the fact that this is a brand new standard and we're just getting started with it. And I'm sure a lot of you feel, kind of overwhelmed implementing this, especially, with AI being such an up and coming technology, right? So let's talk a little bit about this today, right? And we're going to navigate how to transform that anxiety that we may have into a competitive edge for you guys, right? So, all right. So, let's talk about the why, right? Moving from chaos to governance, okay? For the last couple of years, the AI philosophy across industries has been pretty much move fast and break things, right? But in 2026, the game fundamentally changed. We entered the era of evidence-based trust. Okay? If you're a tech or a SaaS provider, your enterprise clients aren't just asking if your product uses AI anymore. They want to know exactly what happens to their data when it enters your models. They're terrified of corporate intellectual property leaking into public LLMs. Okay. If you're in healthcare, you face an entirely different battle. A diagnostic algorithm or patient monitoring system that fails or displays demographic bias isn't just a bad product feature. It can be a threat to human life. And for my colleagues in finance, automated credit scoring, trading algorithms, they're all facing extreme regulatory scrutiny. If your AI declines a loan application, for instance, you can no longer shrug and blame a black box algorithm. Regulators demand explainability. So let's compare operational approaches. Core problem here, ad hoc AI governance, right? The real issue we see as auditors is that most companies are managing AI on an ad hoc basis. The engineering team has one policy, the legal team has another, and product management is doing something else entirely. Ad hoc governance leads to three things: endless audit fatigue, stalled sales cycles, and massive regulatory exposure. That is exactly why the International Organization for Standardization released ISO IEC 42001. It's the world's first global framework designed to turn AI chaos into a repeatable, auditable business process. Let's dive a little more deeply into ISO IEC 42001, right? What is an AIMS, an artificial intelligence management system? Here, we want to demystify what this standard actually is. ISO 42001 establishes an AIMS, which again is an artificial intelligence management system. Think of it as the foundational operating system, quote unquote, for your AI governance. It doesn't look at just one specific model or single line of code. It evaluates how your entire organization manages the life cycle of AI. Whether you're developing your own AI tools or simply deploying third-party AI services. Now, there's a structural advantage to ISO 42001. And that lies within Annex SL. So this is a bit of good news for anybody that maybe is just starting out and feeling a little overwhelmed. Okay. If your organization already is certified to other standards, such as ISO IEC 27001, which is the Information Security Management System standard, or ISO 9001, which is the Quality Management System standard, you actually have a massive head start. ISO 42001 uses the exact same high-level structure, which is known as Annex SL. This means that your existing processes for leadership commitment, internal audits, continuous improvement can easily absorb your AI management system. You aren't inventing a new wheel, you're adding an AI-specific tier to an environment you already own, essentially. So let's talk a little bit about industry mappings and controls, specifically industry risk mappings relevant to the SaaS space, the healthcare space, the finance space. Let's look at how the standards controls map directly to these particular industry risks we talked a little bit about earlier. So for tech and SaaS, we're talking about data integrity and model drift, right? So Annex A8 in the standard targets data quality and ingestion. It forces you to set up continuous performance tracking so you catch model drift before your customers do. If we were to take a look at the healthcare space, we mentioned a little bit earlier about bias and transparency, right? So the standard here mandates that artificial intelligence impact assessments, or AIIAs, right? If your model processes patient data, you have to document your mitigation strategies for algorithmic bias and show how your outputs can be interpreted by human clinicians. Now, this also applies to the finance sector as well, right? So here, we're looking for accountability and robustness. ISO 42001 establishes clear executive ownership. It requires defined risk thresholds and a kill switch mechanism for autonomous systems, creating a clean audit trail to hand straight to regulators. So let's talk a little bit about the audit journey, right? And let's demystify that process a little bit. That's probably something pretty important to those of you who might just be getting started and are feeling overwhelmed. As a certification body, okay, our job isn't to catch you out. It's to validate that your system is resilient. When you partner with us for certification, the process happens in two distinct steps, essentially. So stage one which comes after phase one, essentially. So phase one, sorry, I should probably start there. Phase one is more of a gap analysis, right? Where you as an organization are looking and determining, and making initial documentation benchmark for mapping your existing controls. Where are you at currently, right? Where are the holes that need to be filled? Stage one is the readiness review. Okay, this is the documentary evaluation. And so if you have certifications already, either to 9001 or 27001, this is all going to feel really familiar because this process follows the same pathway. So stage one being the readiness review, we look purely at the documentation, right? We take a look at the AI policy, we take a look at the risk assessment methodology, we take a look at the statement of applicability, and we identify any major gaps before we interview teams. Then, following that, and after we've identified any concerns in that space that you're able to address prior to stage two, that's when the operational audit starts, right? Which is at stage two. This is the on-site, and I say that kind of in quotes because as a lot of organizations these days are maybe virtual, they may be entirely remote in their operations, or very much so remote that a virtual audit is a reasonable way to conduct the audit. Then we'll go ahead and conduct either an on-site or remote implementation check of the controls that have been implemented. So this is where we check to see if you're essentially walking the walk, right? We interview your engineering leads. We'll review your model cards, inspect your incident logs, ensure that your documented processes are actually active in daily operations. Now, once you pass stage two, right, that's when we end up getting to the point where you end up having your certificate issued. Okay. And when we say by past stage two, it's, like any other stage two audit, if we find any nonconformities during that audit, those are addressed, and then the organization moves on to certification, and that certification is valid for the next 3 years. And that's also, just as any other certification would be, supported by a lighter annual surveillance audit process, right? Which those are periodic reviews that ensure that compliance is holding its scale. So the biggest asset you walk away with isn't going to be the paper certificate itself, though. It's the evidence portfolio. You get a clean, independent stamp of approval that you can hand directly to your board, your enterprise prospects, and regulators in order to fast track the trust that comes along with that certificate. All right, so we've gone through obviously some of the deeper aspects as to what ISO IEC 42001 is, the audit journey itself, the risks that may be addressed based on particular, sectors, and how we go about certification itself. So the next thing that I would want to do is to go ahead and open it for some questions from you guys, right? So let's make this a little interactive in the chats. Submit any questions that you may have, and we'll go through and try to address some of those as best we can. Our chat is turned off for this meeting. Are we able to turn chat back on, perhaps?
So anyone can use the Q&A portion of the control panel at the top for any of your questions.
Oh,
The chat
okay.
is closed for the meeting.
Oh, Q&A. I got you. There it is. Sorry, as an auditor, guys, I'm not used to seeing some of these features that had to come through here. So Q&A, that's a good one. So any questions? Anything that we can talk about specifically? How long should an organization retain initial supplier evaluations? So that's a good question. And that's a question that, might apply across different standards as well, right? As an auditor, okay, I would probably say that you're looking at, let's say, like a minimum baseline of 3 years, right? And the reason for that is that aligns with the standard 3-year ISO recertification cycle. One of the things that you have to remember in a recertification audit for any standard, right, is that you have to be able to produce the initial evaluations to prove to the external auditor that your active suppliers were properly vetted at the start of and throughout the certification cycle. So that's where I would say the absolute minimum is 3 years. If we wanted to talk about what might be considered, what may be like an enterprise standard, 7 years is a number that kind of comes to mind, which in my experience kind of aligns with typical corporate financial controls, master service agreements, access logs. If a supplier relationship lasts 5 years, the initial evaluation is usually kept for the life of the contract, plus probably a buffer period. Now, if you are looking at really showing extended compliance in a particular case, 10 years, even to show relative to post-market. But this would be like if your AI products fall under strict cross framework regulations, like for instance, the EU AI's or EU AI Act's high risk categories, where technical documentation, logs, and quality management system evaluations have to be kept for 10 years after the AI system is placed on the market. So that was a good question. It really depends on what your particular circumstances are. But again, baseline 3 years, standard kind of middle 7 years. But then if you fall under like the EU AI Act, 10 years given post-market requirements. So. Any other questions?
It looks like one just came in now.
Oh, here we go. Okay. The entirety of the question. All right. So the question here is, how does ISO 42001 integrate with ISO 27001 and ISO 9001? In addition, what controls overlap with NIST, AIRMF, NIST 800 series, and FedRAMP frameworks? Sounds like we might be talking specifically along the line, or not specifically necessarily, but along the lines of how we're looking with maybe like CMMC and some of those requirements. And then for organizations already certified to ISO 27001, what implementation lift should be expected. So 42001, just like a lot of standards, even like for instance 20,000-1 also integrates fairly well with 27,001 and ISO 9001. And part of that is because of Annex SL, right? As we had mentioned, Annex SL is kind of that glue that holds them all together, since it's pretty similar across all of those standards. If there are any differences, they're usually incredibly minor, but the basic themes are generally all there, right? Within the Annex SL structure, they all share identical top-level clauses 4 through 10, right? So that allows an organization to build an IMS or integrated management system through that. So as far as ISO 27001 and 42001, you have an overlap when it comes to things like asset management, access controls, physical security, incident response, supplier relationships. These are all, you'll notice that these are all kind of shared requirements that are in there. And then there's also the underlying compute infrastructure and raw training data repositories are also protected via your ISMS. So where there's an extension in that case, though, ISO 27001 kind of protects information. We know that 27001 protects information confidentiality, integrity, and availability, that CIE triad, right? ISO 42001 takes over to ensure decision integrity as well. It adds AI-specific controls for algorithmic bias, model drift, transparency and explainability reports, and societal impact. So switching gears a little, if we were to talk about 9001 and 42001, we're talking about traditional quality versus essentially non-deterministic outcomes. So ISO 9001 focuses on deterministic processes. So ensuring that you execute a process the same way, you get the exact same quality output. AI, on the other hand, is inherently kind of non-deterministic. The overlap occurs with things like document control, management reviews, competence, continuous improvement, customer complaint handling. Those all directly align between those two standards. Where 42001 extends a little bit is adapting traditional change management into essentially what we would consider to be model lifecycle governance. So when there's a model that automatically retrains on new data, ISO 9001 processes would ensure that the business logic is met, while ISO 42001 would ensure the retraining doesn't introduce bias or degrade explainability metrics. Now, with respect to some of the other frameworks, so for instance, NIST AI, RMF, NIST 800, and FedRAMP, with NIST AI RMF 1.0, right? So the core areas of overlap in this case are going to be high alignment across, all four functions, right? So govern, map, measure, manage. ISO 42001 Annex A controls map directly to NIST subcategories regarding trustworthiness, socio-technical risk mapping, and continuous tracking. Where there is kind of a key gap or delta, if you will, NIST AI RMF is really highly descriptive technical handbook for offering granular metrics for measuring bias and explainability. ISO 42001 provides the high-level auditable management wrapper, essentially. So policies, internal audits, management reviews required to sustain those NIST measurements. As far as NIST SP 853 is concerned, the overlap in this case really deals with traditional technical controls, which map perfectly, like access control, audit and accountability, system and information integrity for the underlying pipeline infrastructure, right? The delta in this case is that NIST 853 treats an AI model like any other software, binary, or database asset. It lacks specific control coverage for adversarial machine learning attacks, like data poisoning, inversion attacks, automated model drift remediation, societal harm metrics, all of which are explicitly required by ISO 42001 Annex A. Now, as far as FedRAMP is concerned, the overlap here is in that cloud service provider baseline security requirements like encryption in transit or at rest, continuous monitoring, vulnerability scanning. They all satisfy the technical baseline infrastructure that's required to host an ISO 42001 compliant system. Again, the delta in this case would be that FedRAMP focuses entirely on the security posture of the platform hosting the workload. It doesn't validate the ethical data, provenance of training sets, the fairness metrics of an algorithmic output, or the operational governance of upstream AI suppliers. So the implementation lift then for ISO 27001 certified teams then, right, is kind of along these lines. If an organization already operates a mature 27001 2022 ISMS, right, they pretty much already built roughly 50 to 60% of the foundational architecture that's required for ISO 42001. So you're on a good start. If you're already at 27001, you already have a real head start on the process itself. Less gaps to close. So essentially, rather than standing up a second parallel management system, you're really kind of performing more of an operational extension. Now, probably from what I've come to understand is that, you know, an ISO 42001 implementation would, in, you know, a greenfield space, take 6 to 12 months, right? But for a shop that's already, you know, with a mature ISO 27001 system, that lift is generally compressed into probably about 10 to 16 weeks as a project. So definitely a benefit to having 27001 and being able to apply what you've already worked hard for to establishing 42001, right? Now, if you wanted to talk about like what can be reused instantly in these cases, the management core, so like internal audit structures, all the same. Corrective action process, clause 10, all the same, pretty much across all these standards, right? So, I mean, clause 10, when it comes to nonconformity and corrective action, all pretty much require the same things, that you identify a nonconformity, you identify similar nonconformities if they exist or could potentially occur, you identify your root cause, you take action to correct them, all the same requirements across all those different standards. Things like competence, pretty much all the standards require the same requirements for competence as well, right? It's up to the organization to determine what those levels of competence are, and then to essentially keep documented information as evidence of that competence, and where competence may be lacking to provide that competence as needed based on education and experience. So none of the standards really differ in those requirements right there. Same thing with like document control. So document control, pretty much the same across any standard as well. Control your documents, I guess. I mean, you know, it's make sure that you have a hand on creating and updating and approving documents, making sure that, you know, only the documents that you need are or that are required to be used for the system are available, the most recent versions are available, et cetera. So the other thing is certain infrastructure and asset controls. So if you're already performing existing access reviews in 27001, or logging mechanisms, or physical security controls, network segmentation policies, these will all carry over directly to protecting the AI training environment in your model registries, right? Now, where I would say the heavy lifting lives, then the net new effort essentially is pretty much concentrated entirely on the socio-technical and algorithmic requirements of the AI lifecycle, right? So this would be things like the AI impact assessments. This is a little bit different than, or pretty much distinct from a traditional information security risk assessment, right? The team has to build a new process to explicitly evaluate intended use, boundaries, potential bias, downstream societal or ethical impacts on individuals. There's also a net new lift with respect to data governance for AI. This is Annex 8.5 in the standard. So this requires establishing strict provenance tracking for training, validation, testing data sets, ensuring data collection aligns with copyright, privacy, ethical standards. In addition, continuous performance and model drift monitoring would be a net new, which is in Annex 8.7. So this is traditional systems security reviews tend to happen on calendar cycles, right? AI models, however, require continuous engineering controls to detect model degradation, training feature distribution shifts, adversarial validation checks. And so also, when we consider, what the net new lift is going to be, we also want to think about expanding the risk register, right? So your current risk assessment methodology that's been established, if we're talking 27001 or technically even 9001, because 9001 does require an element of risk-based thinking, your current risk assessment methodology has to be updated to ingest non-traditional security vectors. So these would be or include things like training data poisoning, prompt injection vulnerabilities, IP leakage through outputs, unfair algorithmic bias. So yeah. So hopefully that kind of helps you. Hopefully that kind of helped to have you understand a little bit about the integration aspect. So just to kind of recap on that, with Annex SL, the standards do certainly integrate, especially at the core level. Each standard's a little bit different when it gets to the non-core pieces, the annex pieces, right? But they certainly integrate very well based on the Annex SL structure. Now, they also integrate into things like NIST AI, RMF, the 800 series, and then FedRAMP frameworks as well, where you've already established controls that really just kind of have to be applied to the AI management system or the control of it, right? So, the takeaway from that is that organizations already certified to, say, 27001 should expect a certainly lower implementation lift than they would if they were just coming into this without a standard already under their belt. So hopefully that answers the question. Let's see. We also have some other questions. Notice that stage 1 and stage 2 quotes in the UK for certifications seem high, number of days. Is there a global quoting matrix as for other ISOs based on scope, sites, employees, etc.? My understanding with that, that's a good question. My understanding with that is that these would probably be governed by whatever the certification. So for things like 27001, for instance, and it sounds like kind of have seen this, right? And like 9001, they're all based on essentially the overarching requirements for the certification body to conduct assessments. And so the quoting is based on a general mandate grid that's been established based on the number of employees generally that make up the organization's headcount, right? So in the case of 42,001, see. That is actually an interesting question on, because I haven't seen anything specific, any instructions differently for the AIS or AIMS for quoting beyond, say, what's required in like the ISMS, right? So really any of these headcounts should be based on, like the primary factor is always headcount, right? And from headcount, it's determined, there's a mandate grid that gets established based on that. And then you see, and then there is an ISO IEC 42006 document that the certification bodies use. So while I don't know this to 100%, I'm almost 99.9% sure that the same mandate grid is established within 42,006, that's established within 27,006, and 17021 for when we look at like 9001, and I think it's what IAF MD5 for 9001. So I know it's not a perfect answer to the question, but that's really the formulaic response as far as what is more than likely occurring as far as quoting for 42,001, because again, these requirements are all established within those governing documents for us as certification bodies. So for this, it would be 42,000 ISO IEC 42006, and that's the 2025 revision, which would provide that mandate grid. You know, if quoting days are seeming high, I would ask for a specific breakdown and how the days are being quoted, because again, all of these should be quoted based on this formula that's been established. So there's not really any sort of like arbitrary way that the days should be being quoted. Take your point. Now, as far as 42,001, there's a question here on how 42,001 is being adopted in regulated industries. For instance, the Department of Defense, federal contractors, healthcare, and financial services. So again, you know, we kind of talked a little bit about some of these risks that are present in those areas, but just to kind of, you know, look at it from how this is being applied, right? The Department of Defense and federal contractors, for instance, is really applying this based on. So if we look at the DoD, right, the DoD enforces what they would call like the 5 AI ethics principles. This is responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. They kind of are essentially, federal contractors are using ISO 42001 as sort of the operational manual to prove that their software that they're providing is fulfilling those criteria relative to the DoD. as far as the implementation strategy in that case is concerned, so contractors are pretty aggressively building their AI management systems to map directly to, as we had mentioned kind of earlier, NIST AI RMF 1.0, which is the federal standard reference for that. And because the ISO 42001 clauses essentially track seamlessly to NIST's govern, map, measure, and manage functions, a 42001 certification provides those defense contractors and auditors with sort of ready to verify artifacts. The practical impact here is that holding an ISO 42001 certification really kind of removes critical procurement bottlenecks that you might come across during those RFP cycles, which should shield contractors from really exhaustive custom AI vetting questionnaires from any of their federal agency buyers. As far as healthcare is concerned, the adoption of 42001 focuses more on the idea of patient safety, diagnostic validity, and data governance, right, such as HIPAA overlap. The driver here being that machine learning models are really heavily utilized to recommend things like cancer treatments, analyze diagnostic imagery, automate patient triaging. The primary risk, as we kind of mentioned, isn't just data leakage, it's algorithmic bias or model degradation that can end up leading to misdiagnosis. The implementation strategy that the healthcare and life sciences are seeing is that these healthcare entities are integrating 42001 directly into their ISO 13485 frameworks. Again, this makes sure that the data training, the model validation, and automated retraining loops are treated as core components of their product safety. This leaves them with the impact that they end up with traceable audit trails by utilizing Clause 8 of the standard, which is the impact assessment. They log exactly what training data sets were used, how data was anonymized, how clinical fairness benchmarks were maintained. And this also ends up providing FDA alignment. So the FDA might issue separate guidelines on software as a medical device. An active ISO 42001 registry provides the exact lifecycle documentation, version and control shift logs that's required to clear federal regulatory pre-market conformity assessments. Now, as far as the financial services, fintech, this is an area that's really sensitive to credit discrimination. So automated underwriting risk, strict regional transparency mandates, like the EU AI Act has, which impacts global banks and state level legislation like the Colorado AI Act. The driver here being that, an AI system is going to influence things like credit approvals, loan underwriting, fraud detection. And so the bank has to be able to legally defend the output against algorithmic discrimination claims. Now, the strategy that banks are using is by applying ISO 42001 in order to resolve the sort of quote unquote black box dilemma by operationalizing things like model tuning and explainability controls, which is Annex A7. They rely on things like gray box or white box validation testing, such as SHAP or line metrics to explain why an algorithm denied a line of credit or a flagged transaction. And this really allows them to create, affirmative legal defenses, that are relevant to U.S. state laws like the Colorado AI Act, which explicitly cite recognized frameworks like ISO 42001 as statutory evidence of reasonable care against claims of algorithmic discrimination. So essentially applying it to show that they are taking that reasonable care. The other impact here is in continuous drift control. So financial institutions can use this standard to make sure that they're enforcing really strict automated checks against feature distribution shifts. So when changing economic conditions tend to, make past training data irrelevant, this can prevent, quiet collapses and underwriting precision, right? So, yeah, so hopefully that helped to kind of answer a little bit about how, the standard is being very much applied to these regulated industries. And I mean, it's one of those things to see that AI is so prevalent that, these industries would certainly be utilizing this type of technology, and it's really important for them to make sure that they are really addressing those risks that may come along with that, and again, just to recap on that, with DoD, it's federal RFPs and maintaining compliance with DFARS clauses. With healthcare, it's patient safety and algorithmic bias so that you can prevent misdiagnosis, and especially things like HIPAA compliance, which is also important relative to standards like 27001. And then in the financial side of things, making sure that these financial institutions aren't discriminating based on the results and the output from their AI models, right? So in essentially managing the risk that comes along with that. So yeah. Any other questions? Oh, new post. I think maybe all right. Here's a good one. So we do have a question here on what gaps exist in the market today for AI governance tooling, and how would ISO 42001 governance apply to things like CUI, which for anybody who's not familiar with the CMMC side of things, is controlled unclassified information. ITAR, which is the International Trade in Arms Regulations, and export controlled data, or classified adjacent workflows. So, I mean, we know that the acceleration of artificial intelligence has created all kinds of unique challenges where software engineering, data sovereignty, and compliance frameworks kind of collide, right? And so addressing the structural deficiencies in AI governance tool market and the strict technical realities of applying 42001 to highly restricted federal data, we really would have to look at what operational gaps are there. So, as far as gaps in the market for AI governance tooling, so while we know that the governance, risk, compliance, the GRC market, right, has rushed to launch AI governance modules, a critical operational divide kind of persists there. Most current tools treat AI like static IT software assets, which fails to capture the real fluid reality of machine learning. Here are some of the gaps that we're kind of seeing. So where we might consider like the telemetry to policy disconnect, present solutions are kind of split here. You either have engineering centric monitoring model drift latency and training data telemetry tools, or legal compliance centric GRC platforms, which manage static policy questionnaires, risk registers, human approvals. The primary gap being that a unified system that automatically updates compliance posture based on live system telemetry, like model drift trigger automatically flags an ISO 42001 risk register item for review. Another gap you're seeing is in like shadow AI disruption tracking. So software inventory systems kind of struggle to map unauthorized AI adoption across corporate endpoints. There's employees that are really kind of frequently embedding external API calls directly into localized workflows or uploading data to unapproved frontier models. Using ChatGPT when they're not supposed to, or those types of things. The tooling that we've seen kind of lacks the granular application layer visibility that's required in order to dynamically build an accurate AI system register, right? If you don't know that they're using it, then you can't include it in the register. And then there's also things like nonlinear lifecycle auditing. So we know that most GRC workflows kind of operate on static linear timelines like annual or quarterly reviews. AI systems are just inherently nonlinear, though. They're automated continuous training loops can significantly alter a model's decision boundary within hours. So annual, quarterly reviews in those cases aren't really kind of sufficient anymore. And current governance software kind of lacks the automated cryptographically, immutable logging that tracks model weight updates, changes in training data set lineages, corresponding output validations over time. So as far as 42001 governance applying to, highly restricted data workflows, so we're talking the CUI, the ITAR, classified information. This is, essentially integrating ISO 42001 requirements with those really strict federal boundaries in these cases. It requires clear tactical approaches. And so, Annex A5 really, kind of provides the data provenance and lineage, right? You got to think about the federal constraint here being that training sets for, say, like defense applications often contain CUI, right? Or ITAR controlled technical data. The ISO 42001 application under A5, you have to document data sourcing and conditioning. So in an export controlled environment, this data lineage mapping has to explicitly track and prove that no foreign nationals or unvetted third-party data labeling teams had access to the training pipeline. Data conditioning tools that you're using have to operate essentially within an approved environment like FedRAMP, high clouds, or secure on-premise enclaves. So, and then there's also things like, for instance, threat modeling and risk assessments. So the federal constraint here being that standard cybersecurity threat modeling tends to look for, unauthorized data extraction or system accesses. So for defense contractors, the risk assessment process has to expand in order to cover the adversarial machine learning vulnerabilities. This means evaluating the risk of training data poisoning, or model inversion attacks, where an adversary queries a deployed model to reconstruct the classified or proprietary CUI data used to train it. And there's a couple of others. So there's also, some constraints or some application relative to like third-party supplier controls, infrastructure and resource security as well. Third-party supplier controls, commercial and open source models, have opaque data histories. It makes it difficult to verify if foreign components or restricted code bases are included. So when you're implementing initial supplier evaluations, you have to perform deep due diligence on the origin of pre-trained models. So if a base model's training history can't be verified, it has to be isolated, treated as untrusted software, subjected to rigorous validation testing, before that ingestion into defense or aerospace production workflow can occur. So yeah, those are some really great questions. I appreciate you guys asking these. Hopefully that kind of helps to answer some of that. I feel like we could probably go ahead and talk about this for several hours, but looks like we're kind of moving towards the end of our time here. So I really appreciate everybody taking the time to come and let me talk a little bit about the new standard and how it's kind of applying, and hopefully I noticed that since the beginning kind of indicated that there's some anxiety with respect to feeling overwhelmed and implementing this initially. Just know that if you've already have certain certifications in place, some of that anxiety is already meant to be lifted. This integrates really well with things like 27001 and 9001, and even from the healthcare side, 13485. So don't stress too much. It's definitely a different standard for a different technology, but I think that we're going to see some positive implementation examples as we kind of move into this space more. And if there's anything that we can do to help you out with that, please just let us know. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back.